Next, we have Ed Kowalski and Peter Gadiel, both from 9/11 Families for Secure America. I just asked that we're going to have to expedite the testimony. If you can not read and try to summarize, and then we can get to question and answer and move forward. Ed, Peter, good afternoon.
Thank you, Senator.
Okay.
As the father of a young man murdered on 9/11, I'm often asked what my opinion is of whether our situation has improved since 9/11. But as one who's been active for almost a decade in trying to get the government to implement policies that will protect us from terrorism, I have to rephrase the question more properly as how much has our situation deteriorated since 9/11? And the answer is, from my point of view, frightening. Start with the premise the obvious premise stated by the 9/11 Commission, which was that if terrorists can't get into this country, they can't commit violent acts of terrorism into this country. But it's indisputable that unknown numbers of terrorists have entered our country, have had free access to our country since 9/11, and they've come undoubtedly in the thousands among millions of other illegal aliens who simply walked across our borders or entered our country appearing to be ordinary visitors with visas or without visas. Then they frequently overstay and become illegal aliens in every sense of the word. Supporters of rights for illegal aliens demand that illegal aliens be called undocumented immigrants. But what does it mean to be undocumented? It means that your true identity is unknown. Thus, any illegal alien can be a violent terrorist or a felon, violent felon. We don't know. And the fact is that since 9/11, our efforts to secure our borders have simply been window dressing and nothing more. Despite the fact that certain people in our current administration and our previous administration claim that our southern border is secure, that is absolute nonsense. As somebody who's been on the border a number of times and spoken to border agents and people who live on the border, I know that claims that the southern border is secure are simply, absolutely, totally false. Anybody who wants to come into this country can.
Well, you can include the northern
and the northern border as well. The problem, some people actually say that illegal immigration had nothing to do with 9/11. This is absolutely nonsense. One of the greatest assets available to the 9/11 terrorists was the millions of other illegals who were already here. Like grains of sand on a beach, the terrorists could hide in plain sight among the millions of other illegals who were here living freely and out in the open because there's a pathetic lack of interior enforcement in this country. The Commission noted specifically, the 9/11 Commission noted specifically the essential role that driver's licenses played in allowing the terrorists to carry out their attacks. These were the documents that allowed them to gain access to all that they needed to plan, finance, rehearse, and carry out the attacks. And yet, 10 years later, in this body, someone is introducing legislation that would give driver's licenses, authentic U.S. identity documents, to people who claim they arrived in the United States before age 16, who claim they are less than 35 years of age, and I find it difficult to find the words to describe how insane it is that 10 years after 9/11, an event during which driver's licenses were essential, according to the 9/11 Commission, in carrying out these attacks, that somebody would seriously consider granting licenses to illegal aliens. That is to say, an unknown person who may or may not be a terrorist or violent felon. And yet that is seriously proposed, not just in this state, but in others as well. Because I have only a few moments, let me just... The examples of malfeasance by our government are so many that it isn't possible to summarize them. Even the 9/11 Commission couldn't do a proper job. Let me give you one example. It is often cited that the terrorists had visas. But in fact, all these visas were issued in violation of State Department regulations and U.S. law. The 9/11 Commission stated, named specifically 3 visa officials, Thomas Fury, Maura Hardy, and Mary Ryan, who violated the federal law and regulations to give visas essentially like candy for the asking to Saudi nationals and others from terror-sponsoring nations who should have been subjected to very severe screening. Now, as if that wasn't enough, the State Department the following year, in 2002, gave these 3 people performance bonuses for their work in 2001 and promotions. This is the kind of malfeasance and incompetence that is widespread in our government. And yet it doesn't even end with that. At the time of 9/11, 26 nations were eligible for what was called the Visa Waiver Program. That is, their citizens did not need to have visas to come to this country. All they needed was a passport, which may or may not be authentic, and they could come to the U.S. That wasn't enough for the greedy people at the travel industry and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which lobbied for a vast expansion of the Visa Waiver Program, and they successfully did so. In 2011, the Congress passed, and President Bush signed a law which virtually makes any country in the world eligible for the Visa Waiver Program if they meet certain vague requirements. And who decides who meets those vague requirements? But the very same State Department that rewards its own incompetent officials. At least the terrorists of 9/11 were required to fill out a form for a visa. Now that requirement is waived for who knows how many countries, and we're relying on a State Department to determine who has to fill out a visa. A final note. Again, this is not related directly to New York State, but this is federal, but it gives an indication of how frustrated we who have lost loved ones in terrorist attacks are. We all know of the infamous wall that prevented the counterterrorism division of the FBI from talking to the criminal division, from those divisions from talking to the CIA. And we know that infamous wall was responsible for these divisions not being able to connect the dots that would have allowed them to derail the 9/11 plot before 9/11. Unfortunately, the very same person who is in large part responsible for that wall, Jamie Gorelick, was actually named to the 9/11 Commission, and instead of being a witness defending her actions, she was a judge in that commission. She has since been announced as one of the members of the short list of those who may be appointed to head the FBI. What is it about this country that simply cannot hold people accountable and in fact rewards those who should be punished? My son and 3,000 others are dead, okay, because of malfeasance and widespread corruption in our government. Mostly incompetence, but corruption as well. The dead of 9/11 and the dead of the victims of ordinary criminal illegal aliens who get into this country can't speak. Those of us who are their survivors can only marvel at the absolute insult to the memory of our loved ones represented by those who would give licenses to illegals and those who have prevented the proper enforcement of our laws.
Thank you, Peter. Peter, just from my heart, I'm sorry for your loss. I thank you for your work, and I want you to know that our committee will work to ensure that not only the New York State driver's licenses, but all IDs that are issued by New York State continue to be a national standard. And it's a tribute to New York State that those 19 men with box cutters did not have a New York State driver's license. And let's make sure that no terrorist ever does moving forward and uses them, because as we know, terrorists use these various forms of identification, open up bank accounts to become part of the community, right. To rent apartments, pass background checks. So I thank you for your work.
I too, sir, thank you for your the service that your family has given this great nation, the loss of your son, the loss of the family members that have lost over 3,000 members of family members across this country. It's sad that we stand here or sit here 10 years later and we still don't have an immigration policy here in this great nation. It's sad, it's wrong, it's an obfuscation of their responsibility of a Congress and the United States Senate and the President of the United States not to have a immigration policy that is sound and that works. A standard, a national standard for licenses is what is in this state. It has to be across the country, and that's what we need so we can identify people in the future. As we sit here and we talk to you right now, there are people in this nation planning to kill us, probably sitting there with licenses and passports today, illegal extremists, fundamentalists that are ready to take an American soul at the drop of a hat. So we thank you. We thank you for your service. We're obviously very sorry for your losses, but it's a shame on this nation that we still, 10 years later, have not got a decent immigration policy here in this great nation.
Thank you. If I just may make augment Peter's comments very briefly. By way of introduction, my name is Ed Kowalski. Peter asked me to join this organization as a volunteer. We're not politicians. We don't earn a salary from doing what we do. We do this because we have both suffered immeasurable loss. In 2005, my 17-year-old niece was stalked, raped, and murdered by an illegal alien who we subsequently found out was multiply misdemeanor and felony convicted prior to his murdering of Elizabeth. When Peter expanded the charter of the 9/11 Families Group to include people who have been impacted by horrific crimes committed by illegal alien criminals, he asked me to join the organization. And since that time, since 2005, I've been actively involved in the mission of our organization. Unfortunately, since 2005, I've seen dozens of times how sanctuary policies in our state and throughout the state have enabled violent illegal aliens to remain in the U.S. long enough to commit atrocious crimes against innocent Americans. In the last few years alone, I've had the opportunity of visiting Houston, where the last 5 police officers in the city of Houston were killed by people who were in the country illegally and who were multiply convicted of misdemeanor and felony crimes. I've seen teenagers in Los Angeles murdered by a criminal illegal alien gangbanger. I've seen in San Francisco an entire family brutally murdered by someone who didn't like the way the Bolognas were operating their car. He pulled out an AK-47 and blew that family and 2 teenage sons away. This has to stop. I'm here to talk a little bit about New York State. The issue that we're dealing with in New York State is a large one. The criminal illegal alien population, the illegal alien population in New York State, I think, is second only to California, and the criminal illegal alien population in New York State corresponds to that population in measure. As Peter indicated, although the federal government is primarily responsible for securing the nation's borders, the impact of illegal aliens on the criminal justice system reaches far beyond the federal system. The problem and its required solutions may have an even deeper impact on state and local jurisdictions. I am pleased to see Sheriff Don Smith from Putnam County here, who will talk a little about some of the measures that he's implemented in that county. The issue specifically to the incarceration of criminal illegal aliens in New York State really revolves around the fact that the federal government does reimburse states for some costs associated with criminal acts committed by illegal aliens. Under a program known as SCAP, the Department of Justice awarded $324 million in the fiscal year 2010 to states and localities to help pay the salaries of correction officers responsible for incarcerating criminal illegal immigrants. This subsidy in 2010 represented a decline of 18% from fiscal year 2009, when $394 million was distributed by the department. It's important to note, and I'd very much like you to take note of the fact that the SCAP program provides federal payments to states and localities that incur correctional officer salary costs for incarcerating undocumented aliens who have committed at least 1 felony or 2 misdemeanor convictions for violations of state or local law. The point that I'm making, gentlemen, is that these individuals already have a criminal pedigree. Historically, the state of California has received the most funding. The New York State system has been the second most funded state under this particular program. Under the SCAP program, excluding the costs for county and city jail reimbursements, the New York State correction system received $18 million.
Ed, we're going to have to, you can submit the testimony.
Sure,
and,
sure.
and I know that we've spoken at this at length, but we're going to have to move forward. I want to thank you both for your testimony. I'm sorry from the bottom of my heart for my loss. And Ed, if you'd like to just finish up quickly on that.
I'd very much like to be able to say something in closing. The issue that we're talking about, and Don, Sheriff Smith will talk a little bit about this, it is nonsensical for jurisdictions, some of which are home to the largest concentrations of illegal aliens in their state, have policies in place that are designed to impede federal immigration law enforcement, and yet year after year they ask the federal government to reimburse them for costs associated with a problem that their own policies make worse. The Secure Communities Program, under which Governor Patterson signed an MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding to implement in New York State. As of right now, of the 62 counties in New York State, only 14 of the 62 counties are actively participating in this particular program. I'm pleased to note Don Smith was the first county in New York State to join this particular program, and I commend him and our organization commends him for this. The last point that I want to be able to make, there is an easy fix for this problem. Congress should restrict the eligibility for SCAP funding to those jurisdictions that actively participate in immigration law enforcement programs such as Secure Community Program, Criminal Alien Programs, or the 287G program. Commissioner Ray Kelly, Mayor Bloomberg are on the record to say that they disagree with the Secure Communities Program as being something that would discourage immigrant victims and witnesses from talking to cops. Last point that I'll make, given the fact that only those arrested are checked against the federal database under the Secure Communities Program, which allows local law enforcement to identify and report illegal aliens to Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, Commissioner Kelly's comments do not make sense. I'd very much like to be able to have you gentlemen take this under advisement as you consider legislation to address this issue.
I'll just say, in closing, I want to thank you both, and I ask that you, along with other folks who are part of a coalition to make sure that our New York State identification remains solid, remain extremely vigilant. We do have legislation introduced by Senator Perkins, who has introduced legislation to weaken our identification system in New York State. And thank God we have a majority that it would not allow that to happen, but it is gaining steam in the other side, and I ask you to remain vigilant.
Thank you.
Thank you both.